Welcome to the Director's Cut, episode number 3, Liberal and Conservative Christians. I'm your host, Mick Larson, producer and director of the documentary series, What Would Jesus Do on Election Day? The Director's Cut brings on an expert from the documentary. The expert for this episode is Craig Prentiss. Craig is a professor of Theology and Religious Studies at Rockhurst University in Kansas City, Missouri. Craig recently received a Fulbright Scholarship Award to teach at the University of Bucharest in Romania. There, he taught courses in religion, ethnicity, and race in the Americas, and religious pluralism in the United States. Craig is also the author of the book Staging Faith, Religion and the African American Theater from the Harlem Renaissance to World War II, and is currently the editor of Religion and the Creation of Race and Ethnicity, an Introduction. This episode takes a look at how and why Christians split into different versions of Christianity, liberal and conservative. Craig and I will be breaking down the comments from the contributors of this episode. I'll be introducing you to the professors, authors, journalists, and theologians that helped contribute to this documentary series. And don't forget, you can watch the documentary series for free online at www.jd.vote. All right, let's get started breaking down episode 3. Thanks for joining me today. And how was teaching in Romania?
Teaching in Romania was great. The students were super inquisitive. They, unlike American students, they all felt like they had something to contribute to every discussion, where American students have a tendency to be a class with maybe 2-3 students who do all the talking and everyone else sits back quietly and watches, whereas there it seemed like everybody had something to say. So I liked that a lot.
Very cool. All right, let's get started breaking down this episode. And actually, you are the first one up in this episode.
What determined the difference between liberal and conservative Christians in the American context, and really the European context, had to do with the degree to which one wanted to hold Scripture and the traditions of a particular church as the central authorities that guide one. So you go back all the way to the early 1800s and you see a figure like Schleiermacher in Germany that makes the claim, essentially, as he's looking around and all of these things in traditional quote-unquote Christianity are being attacked. You've got the authority of Scripture. Scripture is written by human beings over time, and people start to figure out that, gosh, this thing contradicts that thing, and this thing doesn't look like it was even written by this person, and gosh, what are we doing? And all of a sudden this thing's pieced together by multiple authors, etc., etc. And people start looking at their churches, and their churches are functioning in ways that are hypocritical and problematic and upsetting people, and people are upset about the power structures, etc. So a guy like Schleiermacher comes in and says, hey, you know what? None of this stuff matters anymore. What really matters is what's in your heart, feeling. Okay, feeling is ultimately the determining feature. Now, that idea that feeling is the determining feature really becomes sort of the key element of what becomes theological liberalism. The idea that you measure yourself, the truth, against your own experience, against your own way of making sense of the world. And at some level, to many individuals, that works really well. I mean, I would argue that most people were always doing that to some degree in the past, but to come out right out and say, hey, you know what, that just doesn't conform with my feelings and my way of making sense of the world, can obviously be quite threatening, right? Theological conservatives were those people who pushed back on that idea, saying, look, if it's really just about how you feel, then what difference does any of this, why are you even calling yourself a Christian? Why call yourself a Christian and claim that you still bother to read the Bible and even go to a church if really all that matters is what's in your heart, and this structure and these institutions and these texts are secondary to all of that, and they're all just window dressing. I would caution that conservative Christians also are, at some level, making sense of their traditions based on things that align with their own feelings too. We talk about fundamentalists believing only in the Bible, but of course the Bible says different things, and at some point I'm forced to privilege this thing over that thing. I'm making choices somewhere along the line, and the choices that I make are probably not made just because I've reasoned them and parse them out in a particular way, those choices are going to really reflect probably your cultural background, your social interests, the people you spend time with, your status in a particular social order. All of those things are going to be shaping the way those choices get made. But ultimately, everybody's engaged in that kind of a process.
So, how is this divergence playing itself out today in American Christianity?
In the big picture, what you see, and this is one of the ways we can talk about religion as a category. One of the ways, the way that I like to talk about religion as a category is thinking about the term as a reference to a kind of a discourse, a way that we go about using language, a way that we go about using symbol to give authority to what we say and what we do. And what's distinctive about the stuff that we call religious discourse is we ground that authority in things that transcend the human order. So it's no longer just, Congress passed legislation and they said this and therefore I have this right. It's no longer, because I said so. It's no longer, it's not something that's subject to human reason, human decision making. Instead, we make the claim that the reason we do X, Y, or Z is because God says so, or it's written in the stars, or it's written in nature. I mean, we use the language of nature all the time. Virtually every strand of society uses that language of nature, but the beauty of that usage is it gives us the illusion that nature is self-evident and that when it's nature, it's somewhat uncontestable, right? I mean, and that's how I would tend to frame this category of religion. So when we're talking about liberal versus conservative, what we're looking at, especially in the context of Christianity, you're looking at two different groups, or actually probably more than two different groups, because you can break up liberals and break up conservatives in all sorts of ways. But you're looking at people, and what they do have in common is that they're grounding their claims in a language that is uncontestable. It's contestable only insofar as each of them claims the other to be inauthentic versions of this uncontestable vision, this uncontestable order that we're supposed to conform to in some way, shape, or form. So in that sense, Schleiermacher has, who I mentioned in that rant there, Schleiermacher has some real insight, although I don't think he intended it in this way, and I don't think it was so much self-reflective in Schleiermacher's case, but he has some real insight in that really one's feelings are at the heart of what one claims God to be. And whether God is, whether any of this is, that's not testable in any meaningful way that can be sort of universally accepted in the way that we can sort of test the speed of light in a vacuum, or test whatever it is that we're testing. But it's not testable in that way, and as a result, it's an eternal argument, and it's an endless war that never ends, and nobody's really going to get a leg up on anyone else, because what does that even mean? The only things that are going to change, and I do think to some degree maybe we're seeing some of those changes today in terms of the percentage of the population that identifies as religious, that identifies as Christian, that identifies as evangelical, that identifies as fundamentalist. We see a shift I think the numbers are showing a pretty dramatic shift over just the last 20 years. And really, frankly, in just the last 10 years, we're seeing a pretty profound generational shift on these questions. So what's going on there? Well, what's going on there, I would argue, is we're seeing different socialization patterns. That those socialization patterns, they're impacted a lot by technology. Certainly with young people, that's the case. They're impacted a lot by families that are less inclined to. This goes back to that book. I can't remember what year it came out. At the very end of the '90s, I think, that book called Bowling Alone. You know that? You remember that book?
No, I'm not familiar with it.
I wish to God I could remember the name of the guy who wrote it. But it's a book called Bowling Alone, and it was all about something that had been developing through the 80s and 90s, where people were doing things alone much more often. Where, you go back to the 50s and 60s, and there are all of these, these organizations like the Elks Lodge, and these women's groups that would get together to do and they do all these things, and those are far less common, partly because maybe that's just the nature of capitalism in our society, in that people have gotten to the point where they just don't have the time. That may have also been compounded by suburbanization. That's been compounded by the entertainment value that we get out of our own televisions in our own homes. So fewer and fewer people are coming together to do things. Sports, one of the few things that we do, although it's not really we're sharing the moment largely with joint cheering and yells and screams, but not a lot of dialogue at a game, right? You might be chatting with your buddy while you're watching it, but it's a different story. But we're seeing a drop in church attendance in the United States, and that's been extra compounded. It was dropping before, but it really got compounded with the COVID situation, where all of these churches and synagogues and mosques started putting services online, and there was a subset of the population that kind of liked it, and there was another subset of the population that didn't like it, but they also got used to not going anymore every Sunday, or every Friday evening, or every whatever it is that their tradition had. And so all of those things are leading to a certain kind of social disconnect, and that different socialization pattern seems to be also having an impact on the numbers of people who identify as Christian at all, much less liberal Christian or conservative Christian. At the peak in the 1980s, you had something like, it was close to 40% of Americans who identified themselves as evangelical Christian, and at that point, for most of them, that was translating into a form of fundamentalist evangelical Christian. Today, that number is down to closer to like 15%, a very loud proportion, a very politically active proportion, a very influential proportion, but it's a much smaller percentage, and it's also an older percentage. Their children do not seem to be, on the whole, following them down that path. So, to the extent that these questions about how Christians define themselves and separate themselves today, as opposed to a while back, I think we should always be first paying attention to these what shifts there have been in socialization patterns, because really all of this boils down to that kind of socialization. I mean, if there were no society, there would be no one talking about God. There might be a God, but nobody's going to be talking about it, and there wouldn't be institutions, right? So you have to have people coming together to come up with these things, and then when people aren't coming together in the same way, or people are coming together in different ways, and they're aligning themselves along different paths, the ideas that we have about what those institutions should be, what these identities should be, they're always in a state of flux.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting.
Okay, next up we'll hear from Magumbai Joet, a law professor and author of Exceptional America: What Divides Americans from the World and from Each Other.
Yes, religious beliefs are foundational beliefs that tend to shape how an entire person's worldview operates. And Americans are much more religious on average than other Westerners. And also, America, as the only Western democracy, was a huge share of Christian fundamentalists, people who believe that the Bible is literally true. So looking at data, between a third to 40% of Americans are creationists. We think that the theory of evolution is nonsense, and that the world was created essentially as in Genesis. And people who hold these views also tend to have very hardline positions or questions like abortion, contraception, gay rights, and also it fosters a kind of absolutism that extends to other areas, such as economics. The notion that big government is oppressing American society is widely accepted among Christian ultra-traditionalists because the black and white approach that they have to religion also extends to other areas like economics.
So, how are fundamentalist Christians shaping Christianity in America?
Well, there are two major strands of fundamentalism. One seems to be shrinking, and the other seems to be growing within the fundamentalist world. But at least 30 years ago, the two dominant strands were those strands that were politically active and those strands that believed that political activism was not a proper use of Christian time. Those latter folks made the argument that the object of the Christian is to preach the gospel and save the souls, whereas there were other Christians who made the argument that the object of the Christian is, yes, to do those things and to save society as a whole and to transform society. In many ways, it kind of goes back to that kind of Calvinist model that imagined a society built around Christian institutions, Christian decision-making, Christian structure, and that basically Scripture served as a blueprint for society. And so when Calvin puts together the social order in Geneva in a way that he thinks is patterned after the New Testament, that's an illustration of somebody who thinks, oh, we have to order the whole society in this way. And that was the mentality, for instance, of the Puritans who come to this country. And of course, at that point, we didn't have fundamentalism as we imagine it later. Fundamentalism as a concept makes a doctrinal argument that Scripture itself has to be interpreted in a literal way, and that's a response to theological liberalism, theological modernism, but it's also a response to things like the scientific revolution, Darwin and evolution and that sort of thing. So there's a certain irony in it, in that it grows out of the very impulse to be able to claim knowledge, real knowledge of the world, in the way that science claims real knowledge of the world with the measurable stuff. So here you got a bunch of people say, well, we have that real knowledge too, but it's all right here in the text. These were not arguments that Luther or Calvin or the Roman Catholics in the Reformation, that wasn't the argument they were having. They were making an argument about how the text could be interpreted, making an argument about whether or not non-clergy should have access to those texts. But they also had a confidence, well, I shouldn't say this, I should say Protestants had a confidence that when people read the text, they would see it clearly, it would make sense to them, and they would understand. Of course, in that, you can make arguments about all the debates that took place in the Reformation, but the one debate that the Catholics really did have right, without question, was, hey, when people pick up the text, they're going to read it very differently. And that's, in fact, what happened. And the Catholic solution to that certainly isn't the solution that most Americans would think is a good one, where, you know, their solution is limit it to only these people who get to read it. But it was still their understanding that, you don't want to let everybody read this book because they won't know what the hell to make of it. And so the fundamentalism that emerges today is focused on a very different thing than what Calvin was focused on. He wasn't focused. There were plenty of non-literal interpretations of the text that both Calvin and Luther and Zwingli and the Anabaptists, they applied plenty of non-literal, but that literalism comes to be a response, a 19th century response to all of these other things going on in society. So ironically, it's not Christianity as it always was. It's a new kind of Christianity, which would be upsetting to a lot of fundamentalists who don't accept that that's a new kind of Christianity. Christianity's always been about the Bible. And then you ask them, well, what did you do for the first 300 years of the movement where they didn't have the Bible? That's another story. We won't go into that.
What do you think about his thoughts that rigid religious views also shape someone's worldview?
So what I would argue essentially then is, yes, they do, but at the same time, those people, rigid religious views are not the thing that exists separately from all of these other things. Like, we can't separate those rigid religious views from other kinds of rigid views, in the sense that it's people who are attracted to that rigidity are the same people who are attracted to rigidity in, what one should be eating for breakfast, or what,
Yeah.
or what one, what beer's the real American beer, or which one. It's rigidity. It's a personality trait, and ambiguity. I mean, at some level, all of us, to some degree, seek some kind of control of our environment. We use language for that. We use habits of daily living for that. We use all sorts of things to control the somewhat chaotic lives and chaotic world that we encounter. And some people are more comfortable with a little bit of that chaos, and other people are so terribly uncomfortable with that chaos that they do anything to control. And that's a personality trait, and it's likely to be put onto this particular kind of discourse. There's a very old debate about whether or not whether religion, quote unquote, is the problem. If we just got rid of religion, then we'd be somewhere. Mm-hmm. It'd be so different. Well, I don't think so, and I think I would argue that at a certain point, if we're going to call religion, if I'm going to call religion this particular kind of discourse that appeals to some authority beyond us, at a certain point we're almost always going to be falling back on that kind of argument. Just like we do see, because at a certain point it's not enough that my expertise tells me something and I'm going to persuade you that my expertise tells me. At a certain point, we're going to come to these moments where we need something else to push us forward in a debate with some other form of power in the world, right? And this is a strategy. It's a tool for that. And once these ideas get out there, and once the universe is filled with these kinds of discourses, then they get used in different ways, and people form their identities around them, and people form their way of making sense of themselves around them, and their thought patterns shift, and all sorts of things happen once it comes out into the world, and then becomes a tool that we can utilize. But I don't. If somehow tomorrow everyone woke up and forgot entirely about what the Bible was, about what God, nobody knew what that word was, and blah blah blah, I don't think it would take long before we have some other word, some other collective texts, some other things that people would point to try and give authority to whatever it is they're trying to, simply because the nature of being a person in the world is to be a person that shares space with other people. And if you're sharing space with other people, questions of power arise. And when questions of power arise, the question of powers battling other powers. And I'm not talking about like huge army power. I'm talking about just basic interests that conflict with one another because we're different, right? So something comes up. That's how I would put it.
I would say you're 100% correct, because every society in the history of the world has had religion. So it's going to happen one way or the other.
Yeah, every society in the history of the world that we know of has argued about authority, about power, about truth. What gets classified, I don't know enough about the kinds of discourses that emerge among the Tupiniquah people or among the, I don't know enough to know.
But you don't need to know exactly.
But yeah, and it might not look like the quote-unquote religion that we're used to, but there are going to be things that get contested, and there's going to be a point where people realize, well, it's not enough for me to say this is the truth because I happen to be bigger than these other people and I can beat them up. And if I can beat them up, then my truth goes, because eventually there's going to be somebody bigger than me. And eventually there'll be somebody bigger than that guy. And somebody else can beat somebody else up. And we keep getting to this point where this army can conquer that army, can conquer whatever. At a certain point, we've got to ground something in something other than it's the law because I say so. we've got to come up with something else. And even in the context of a democracy, we've got this kind of almost metaphysical concept of the voice of the people, and it's as though the people speak with some unanimous voice, Oh, the people have spoken. It's, a 53...
55%.
Yeah, 55 to 45%. Oh, the people have said something. When, and even of those 55% who are on the same side of a thing still want it for different reasons. I mean, I think what religion does, and when I'm going back to that definition I gave of like religion as a kind of a discourse, a way that we talk about things and give authority to things. What I think that discourse does is it amplifies things that probably were already there. It functions a bit like alcohol in the sense that you come to see people's personalities in ways, and the alcohol gives them a certain kind of confidence that they otherwise wouldn't have. And that connection, that ability or capacity to connect how you see the world with how the God that you believe made that world sees it, that gives somebody an incredible confidence and also gives them a level of certitude.
Up next is religious columnist, reporter, and author Bill Timaeus. He's the author of The Value of Doubt.
Jesus lived by story. Jesus told stories to invite us into thinking about them. Today, I think we are required, we really have no choice but to live by metaphor, by allegory, by myth. When you become a biblical literalist, when you become a fundamentalist, you throw off the opportunity to see broader truths.
What do you think about Bill's assertion there?
Well, look, I wouldn't get into the argument about whether or not they don't see broader truth, because from the fundamentalist perspective, it's you and me who don't see the broader truth, and Bill Timaeus who's not seeing the broader truth. I don't speak in that language of the truths, but I do agree that we do see things through story. Fundamentalists also tell stories, and the stories they tell may be stories directly out of Scripture, and they interpret those stories in particular ways that sometimes they disagree with one another, but there are also ways that I might disagree with the way that they're making sense of the story, where I'm going to sit here and want to say, well, let's think about the context in which the story emerges. That's not the relevant question for them. The question is, how's God speaking to them through these words? But story is, in fact, the central way that human beings find ways to not just to communicate at the level of information, but to communicate at the level of feeling. Because we tell stories because we feel along those stories. We place ourselves in these stories. We can imagine ourselves as characters in these stories. And the effectiveness, one of the things biblical scholars seem to agree on about Jesus, and again, we don't know much. We really know very little about Jesus himself, but one of the patterns that emerges from the texts, the earliest texts that we have, some of which are included in the New Testament, others aren't, but that he was in part a storyteller. He'd tell these parables, and these parables, about what distinguishes a parable from another story is that it tends to put a set of questions on your lap, make you feel somewhat uncomfortable. Usually these parables have kind of awkward and almost unpleasant turns in them, things that are paradoxical, things that you're, oh my gosh, what if I were in those shoes? And he'd tell these stories. We don't, what he meant by the stories, those are going to be different things. We're getting those stories, first of all, in texts filtered by somebody else's rewriting of them. We don't know if their rewriting was actually his words. And then we also have them placed in other texts, like in the Gospels, where those words are now placed in contexts that we see in several cases. We see very different contexts. Look at the Beatitudes. When Matthew does the Beatitudes, there are I think 8 different propositions. When Luke does them, there are 4. Luke has him talking to the disciples. Matthew's talking to a crowd, blah, blah, blah. I mean, everybody's doing these things differently. The stories are different. So it's a story that's being retold as a new story, that's being retold as a new story.
and we hop back and forth to what's useful for us at a particular time. And I mean, so in that sense, I agree completely with him that that story's at the heart of what we do. I would dispute the idea that somehow fundamentalists lack the capacity to understand these texts as story. I think, if anything, they see them as these grand stories that they're a part of in ways that non-fundamentalists might not see themselves as being a part of that story anymore.
Do you think if you're a literalist, word for word, does that like give you a free pass intellectually that like, well, this is what the Bible says, so I don't need to think about it?
It may, but I would make the argument that nobody's actually a literalist. That it's just some literalists don't know that they're not literalists, because there's always a selective privileging going on with the text, that we are forced to make decisions about what we're going to take. You know, the things that Jesus says about your family, and that, you know, who your real mother and brothers and sisters are in the Gospel of Mark, one who does the will of God goes directly against your honoring of your father and your mother. Okay? So how am I going to work that out? Well, you can work it out in a lot of different ways, but you're forced to privilege one narrative over another narrative. So every biblical literalist that I've ever met has never been willing to say, well, my father's, no, if my father, that you have to honor those, especially in fundamentalist culture. There's definitely like a filial piety that goes on with respect to, you know, and in fact, that was one of the great debates when the evangelical movement moved from its primarily northern focus among northern theologically educated people to the South. And it brings these stories about, you know, maybe the father, and the father isn't the person you should be listening to if somebody else is preaching the gospel properly. They had all these young evangelical preachers in the early 1800s showing up in these southern states, preaching against slavery and preaching in ways that were undermining of the patriarchal culture that dominated the Anglican South, and that challenging of that way of understanding Christ's message ends up eventually leading to the evangelical movement in the South adapting to the kind of patriarchal hierarchical framework, and rejecting some of those things. But basically what you have are two people reading a story differently. One, you're reading a story of a Jesus who's saying, hey, guess what? None of that stuff matters. That daddy's the boss and the plantation owners, none of that stuff makes a difference. What really matters is the word of God. And then all of a sudden you put them in a context where, guess what? They're not going to let you preach if they don't.
Yeah,
and pretty soon
nobody's going to show up to your church.
Nobody's going to show up to the churches, and nobody's going to be paying your salary. And pretty soon, the message adapts. And pretty soon it's, well, maybe slavery is not so bad. And maybe we don't want to push that anymore. And so all of a sudden these, radically abolitionist movements like the Methodists and the Baptists were in their earliest of days end up splitting over those questions because
the environment they're in.
Yeah, the environment changes the reading of the story. So, while I respect Bill Timaeus's assertion, I think it's probably unfair to the fundamentalists that they're not appreciating story and the importance of it. It's just that they're reading it very differently.
I remember asking my dad what he thought about Bush going in Iraq, and he gave me his answer was a Bible verse.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, dude.
What was the Bible verse? Do you remember?
I have no idea. And I was like, dude, I was asking you a question. I wanted what your thoughts were on this. And so I was just like, oh, all right, whatever.
Yeah, well, if anything, that's a testament to the fact that the story's more important for some than the kind of, I'll give you these rational reasons why I think X, Y, or Z will lead to this event. That's, fundamentalists come back to these stories time and time again. And the beauty of the Bible is that we're talking about collections of texts pieced together over literally 1,000 years that are pieced together by different authors with different intents and different audiences, and therefore you've got so many stories and so many potential ways to read it. I mean, if the Bible were the phone book, then it would, which to our younger viewers, there used to be a book that we used to keep our younger listeners, there used to be a book that you used to keep all the phone numbers and addresses of people in. But if the Bible were the phone book, nobody would read it anymore. It's not interesting. It's not storied. And it's also straightforward. Or if the Bible were an instruction manual for putting together an IKEA thing, it's like, actually, that's a bad example because there are many ways to read those instruction manuals, and that's why I screw up putting together my IKEA furniture. But for the most part, it intends to be very straightforward, right? Mm-hmm. So, the more ambiguous, the broader the set of possibilities, the more likely that people will keep talking about the story. And if it were just like, do this, this, and this, and we're done, nobody would read it or care about it after a while because it wouldn't fit in. It wouldn't be adaptable to our lives.
All right, up next is Jimmy Itzak, former director of church life, youth, missions, engagement at Second Presbyterian in Kansas City, Missouri.
We actually discard and dismiss and give permission to certain scriptures to evolve all the time about women in leadership or about slavery. Do a search on slavery in the Bible. Slavery is very well sanctioned, protected, guideline, not really condemned very harshly, almost at all. And we're allowed to let those scriptures evolve with the times as we grow, as we learn. Learning about the earth and the stars, and Galileo all of a sudden shows up on the scene and people called him a heretic because the Bible didn't say that the earth and the sun had this relationship, and science comes in and we're allowed to let our things evolve.
So what do you think about Jimmy's idea of letting scripture evolve and grow over time?
Well, it's not about letting it. It's going to whether we like it. But he's 100% right that when it comes to how something like slavery, for instance, we start privileging other texts that allow us to move away from something that, fortunately, a significant portion of the human species started to think, oh, there's a real problem with this. As soon as we started imagining the idea of human rights and individual rights and the value of the individual, the idea of slavery becomes an abhorrent one for different reasons, and I think it's a good thing. So yeah, I think that's a perfect illustration. I will do one little correction. The problem with Galileo from the church's perspective was not that the Bible didn't say it. The problem was that the methods that Galileo used to draw these conclusions were the methods of science, of observation through a telescope and through mathematics. And those are different authorities. It's the shift in authority that was the problem. The Roman Catholic Church they were not a fundamentalist organization. They were more than happy to give a wide latitude to different scriptural readings. What was threatening about Galileo, Copernicus, what was threatening about it was that they were using tools that were not the tools that we're talking about a time where the ultimate authority were the claims of the Bishop of Rome and the various bishops in the Roman Catholic Church in the Western European context. So when you come up with a new standard against which that authority is measured, that's the real threat. But it wasn't Scripture itself, although Scripture did tell a different story, but Scripture wasn't the only thing that told a different story. Our experience told a different story too, because our experience tells us that we're not moving at 100-something thousand miles an hour through space, and that we're not, spinning around the sun. Our experience tells us that the sun rises and the sun sets. So it's not just about that. It was about the tools that Galileo is using.
Next, we'll hear from Bill Timaeus again.
If you live only by rigid creeds, you're going to miss the beauty of the world, the art of the world, the opportunities for discussion about the metaphorical ways that life proceeds. And I really think that the last thing Jesus would be is a Christian fundamentalist. It's not to say that there were not and are not some things about which he's clear. You know, who is God? How do you treat neighbors? You know, there are some foundational truths for sure.
So what do you think about Bill's comment that the last thing Jesus would be is a Christian fundamentalist?
Again, this is the game we all play, right? This is an illustration of how we point to Jesus and to give authority to, and the beauty of it is that he's not here, so he can't tell us what he was going to think. So it's an illustration of how we use Jesus as an authority to make a claim about a particular current situation. And in Bill Timaeus' perspective, there's something wrong with Christian fundamentalists. So Jesus, we all know that Jesus wouldn't do that, right? Well, I don't know that. I have my suspicions. My own kind of worldview probably aligns much more with Bill Timaeus' perspective on fundamentalism. But that's not an objective claim. It's the claim we want to have, you know, and it's every bit as problematic as any other. So, you know, I suspect, if you want to know my real suspicion, is that if Jesus were actually here, most of us would think this guy doesn't see the world at all like any of us do. I mean, because he lived 2,000 years ago in a very different context, in a politically charged context in which the politics are completely different now, and all of us would be, I suspect, very confused by him. So that's what I would say. But we always want him to sound just like us.
I don't think the billionaire class would be thrilled if Jesus came back.
Well, certainly if Jesus in fact said the things that we have him saying in these Gospels, then it would be a hard sell, I think. But yeah.
All right, up next is Jimmy again.
There's a lot of central messages that he has, and I think it's where you came from and how you were raised to determine which of the words that we have are the ones that are most inspiring to you. The truth is that either Jesus' life or his death is going to be more important to you. And depending on which one you choose to find more inspirational will determine how you live your life, how you vote, how you treat other people, the things that are important to you and what you pass on. And for me, that's become a defining difference in my personal theology. Is it more important how he lived or more important that he died? So if you grew up like I did in a conservative evangelical home, it was almost a daily conversation that we talked about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, but primarily the fact that Jesus died and that Jesus rose from the dead. And that is quintessential conservative evangelicalism. It is this focus and this obsession with what is coming next. And there's an imminence to it. And so it doesn't matter if people are happy now, because this is all temporary. So make your sacrifices and give up. You don't get the right to be happy here because happiness is to come. So if you really hold on to that idea of Jesus' death and resurrection is more important, then life is very temporary here. And people can hang on a little bit longer in whatever state that they're in, and God's gonna come back, and one day there will be no more tears and no more anger, no more pain, and we're all gonna live as one big happy family, assuming that God chose you to be a part of that family. And so if you focus on the life of Jesus, you begin to see this counterintuitive way to treat people, because it's not, as Romans says, selfishly based. It's not selfish ambition that take what you can, get all you can. All of a sudden, Jesus talks about sacrifice for the betterment of others. He talks about quality of life. That is what intrigues me about the life of Jesus. And if you are more intent and focused on that, it's going to change the here and the now. It's going to change how you treat people. It's going to change how you react to the mistreatment of people. It's going to help you understand how to fight against injustice, oppressive systems. It's going to help you fuel this sense of mercy and seeing that life on earth is meant to be lived and experienced and celebrated.
So, yeah, what do you think about that concept?
This is an interesting one. Hearing these, and that was a theme that came up in this documentary that I thought was interesting. The idea that what sort of separates this is the focus on the life versus the death, and I think there's probably, I feel like there's some truth to that narrative. Certainly, quote unquote liberal Christians tend to focus a lot less on that death and more on Jesus in this kind of rabbinic role as a teacher about how to live a life. I would say, he frames it in terms of the choice. If you choose this way, you choose the other. I would see it as our dispositions are leading us to make these choices, and I'm not sure that they're even really choices. They're just the way that we read it, but they do have different consequences, and the likelihood that we're going to shift in terms of our perspectives are almost certainly going to depend upon different kinds of socialization processes that would lead to somebody now seeing things some way differently. In the same way that you see over and over again, for instance, families that would point to the text to give authority to not giving equal rights to gay people, for instance, and then all of a sudden, their son turns out to be gay, or their next door neighbor's kid who seemed like such a nice boy, he turns out to be gay, and then they realize, but he's still a nice boy, and I can't believe this person's going to actually burn in hell for all these things. And in other words, their socialization shifted their position so that now they're like, if you look at American polling on gay rights, 20 years ago, it's unbelievably dramatic how different this has been, and that has everything to do with socialization patterns. So those people may have set out to interpret the text in a particular way, but they were socialized in such a way that eventually that became untenable, that tension shifted for them. So I don't think it's the choice to read it one way or another. I think it's more about how these various social patterns impact how we're going to read it. And sometimes that dissonance becomes so great that we say, I can't read it like that anymore. Maybe it meant something else.
But back to your first comment in this whole segment is about how I feel.
Yeah, well, this is, by the way, kind of classic liberal theology perspective then, right? That it is ultimately how you feel. And of course, people's feelings are ultimately what determined the shift in questions like how gay rights was perceived by a plurality of Americans. It is that it didn't feel right anymore. We liked Will and Grace, we liked Ellen, we liked these people on TV that we saw regularly, and they seemed not very threatening, and they seemed not so. Maybe it can't align with this feeling that I have that these and here an illustration of the fact that even if you identify as a very conservative Christian, it's possible that your attitudes can change based on these things. And a lot of people who did identify as very conservative Christians did have their attitudes change. Although, probably some of them no, precisely because it
didn't bother them.
Yeah, it did. That they saw that they held a particular standard with their reading of the text, and their reading of truth and their reading of God, which probably aligned with just their reading of themselves. It's who they were and who we are. So,
what about this idea? I heard someone say liberal Christians have been secularized.
Yeah, that's another kind of tricky word. There's a lot of scholarship in the world of religious studies about what one means by the secular. If you go back to the medieval period, the word secular was used almost exclusively to identify a certain kind of priest. In other words, the priest that wasn't a member of a religious order. They were secular priests. They were the ones. And then and the religious were those who took these vows to an order. So the word secular means different things at different times. I think it has. I'm not really sure how useful the term is anymore, but it certainly holds a political usage in that It allows both religious people and people who don't identify as religious people to draw a kind of line that they want to stay on one side of. And we imagine this thing is the secular and this thing is the religious. And it goes back to those questions about, is peyote, drug policy, a secular policy or religious policy? Well, it depends on what your perspective is. Is that, and so, yeah, I mean, I think there's something to the thesis that that the world's discourse about God, I shouldn't say the world, let's say the Western world, and its discourse about God certainly shifted. It's changed over time, and a lot of this comes back, frankly, to a pretty radical political shift that happens in Western Europe by the 1600s. You have a horrible war that is premised on religion. You have Calvinists and Catholics, and they're all killing Anabaptists, and they're all killing each other, and the Lutherans and they're killing it. It's a messy war that goes on for 30 years, wipes out huge portions of Europe, and by the time it's over, you've got a population that's tired, and they're cynical, about their own traditions, and they're cynical about, and so they arrange a peace, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. They arrange a peace in which they divide up Europe into these territories that are really the beginnings of our nation state concept. But in order to operate as nation states, they have to assert powers that that these kings never had before. If you go back to what Western Europe was in the 1500s, in the 1400s, in the 1300s, basically the church was not only the largest landowner in all of Europe, but it also was central to the taxation system. Everybody owed a tenth to the church. Peasants had to put in 1 month out of every year to work church lands. It was also the sole base of the educational system. They did all of the clerical work. They determined who was or who was not married, which was something that had gone on since about the 1100, really the mid 1000s, but it gets formalized in the 1100s. You have all of these roles that today we associate with government, including the raising of armies. I mean, the Pope raised armies to defend his papal lands. Today that sounds like bizarre. Imagine little Francis, running around raising armies to defend. That's not how it works. We think of the Pope as a spiritual leader, but there's a reason we think of it like that, and we think of it like that because in order for this Western liberal nation state to succeed, we had to create a world in which this institution, in this case the Roman Catholic Church, was pushed to the sidelines in terms of the power that it could assert to do the things that today we associate with modern nation-state governance. So once we do that, all of a sudden we've got these new realms, and we'd call one realm the religious. And we use language for that realm that frankly would not have been used 1,000 years earlier, that identifies that religious as the things of the heart and the things of the soul. And this is what religion is. These internal things. And of course, one of the reasons why Protestant theology grew the way it grew was because it appealed to precisely that political movement. It appealed to that sense that your salvation is not dependent upon your relationship to this institution, the church, anymore. Your salvation is dependent upon a grace of God given to you, not of any merit of yourself, just by God's mysterious power. You have that grace, you have that faith, or you don't have that faith. And that's what determines whether or not you're saved, as opposed to a system in which whether or not you're saved depends on how often you're participating in the sacraments, and whether or not you die in a state of grace is determined by the church thanks to these participation in these sacraments. So Protestantism appeals to those who say we shouldn't be going through the church for all these things anymore. And so this whole new environment develops in Western Europe that leaves out
the whole rest of the world, because the world didn't operate that way. Governance happened in so many parts of the world where people constantly appealed to God or gods, where people constantly appealed to priestly classes, where people constantly appealed to various texts in some cases, or appealed to traditions that they had that today we would call those religious traditions, right? But in the West, this divide develops because of this new shift. It's religion exists because it becomes a religion, quote unquote, as a category that we now talk about as like this internal spiritualized thing. It comes to be precisely as a management tool for organizing society after the Peace of Westphalia, after a new order, after decades of violence and killing. This becomes the way that we separate. So what gets classified as the secular and what gets classified as the religious, these things have a history, and it's not a history that just happens. It's a history that serves particular interests, and for better or for worse, it serves those interests. And so now, when we look at a country like Iran, for instance, and we see we look and we say, oh my God, it's run by these clerics. They're living in this ancient time. Well, Iran just didn't have the same history that we had, right?
Yep.
So they're no different than the Western world was.
They haven't had the Reformation.
They didn't have the Reformation. They didn't have that particular set of violent acts that produced a different mentality, that produced, so they don't classify things the same way we do. But it's not like they're some sort of conscious attempt to skirt reality. It's that our reality was shaped by a particular history, and it's a particular history that we take so for granted that we imagine that there's obviously a thing as the secular and there's obviously a thing that there's the religious, whereas 600 years ago everybody would say, what the hell are you talking about? Even if you could do it in the language of the people you're speaking to, they still wouldn't have known what the hell you're talking about. So
yeah, and the context of that quote is that liberal Christians have been secularized is the context of that social movements, the churches lag behind social movements. That usually it's the social movement, at least in recent history, that moves the needle, and then the churches get on board after the fact or at the very end of the movement. And I think maybe gay marriage is a good example of that.
it depends on the churches, right? I mean, there are super progressive churches that were ahead of the curve on a lot of these questions. But certainly that's been the case with a lot of the churches.
Mainstream.
Yeah, quote unquote mainstream.
Up next is Rob Ryersey. Rob is the political organizer for the evangelical organization Vote Common Good. He's also the author of the book Running for Our Lives, A Story of Faith, Politics, and the Common Good.
How am I living my life now? And you recognize hell can be something that people experience today and in this world. And I don't want to bring hell to this world. I want to bring heaven to this world. And that shifts your focus to, how I exist in the world, how I live today. And then the teachings of Jesus and the example of Jesus and how Jesus lived becomes much more important because we're trying to follow that example.
Again, I see him privileging texts and privileging a Jesus that speaks to this world as opposed to another. And you can find passages. I mean, Jesus talks about his Father's kingdom and he makes parables about his Father's kingdom. So there's this other world, there's something happening in the future. There's language of Jesus talking in that way too. And so, I like his vision. It's a beautiful vision. It's a perspective. It's a perspective. This is clearly not a self-evident divide here. It's not the Jesus that says this, but the fundamentalists say that. It's like, it's two sides of a coin, and the fundamentalists are all heads, and the liberals are all tails, and it's like, it's little heads, little tails. It depends. Again, depends on what Jesus I'm looking for. Yeah, well, it reminds me. I can't remember the study, but it was pretty popular. It was out in the papers when it came out. Some people may have been familiar with it. There's a study about maybe a decade ago of people, and they started surveying people about various political positions, various views about things in the world, and asked them to align themselves, how they felt about these various positions. And then part of this study involved them talking about if they believed in God, what do they think God thinks? Guess how that came out, right? It came out that God almost all the time thought a lot like the person who laid out their own positions on this. It goes all the way back to, I'm trying to remember the ancient Greek figure who pointed out that if the world were just horses, then God would look like a horse. We have this.
What I'm hearing is that there's a projection going on.
Yeah, there's projection. There is. There's no way to not do that. By the way, I'm not saying that like, oh, look at these silly people with their I'm always projecting things onto things. You and I were talking about politics to some degree earlier today, and a lot of this is me projecting my own hopes, my own wishes on what I think the public will do. It's not fun. It's not fundamentally different. It's kind of what we do, but it's my job to be aware of it, and my job to help
give it context.
To give it context and to help people be aware of it in their own way of talking about these things, and to be able to observe it in others. It's how we operate, man. It's just humanity being humans.
And it is part of our evolution as humans that we project things are on everything.
Yeah, like when we look onto a wall with lots of with a lot of texture to it, and we see eyes and a face and a mouth. When it's not, it just happens to be a thing. We're always projecting stuff that we're familiar with onto the stuff that we're not.
Well, I think back before the Abrahamic gods, like if you're a wheat farmer, there was a wheat god, and if you're a dairy farmer, there was a dairy god.
It's not a surprise that you've got a lot of these gods of thunder and gods of whatever that become like the central god, because it's scary stuff, lightning, it's storms in an agrarian society. I mean, it's not a coincidence also that most of the evidence seems to indicate that the ancient Hebrew people, this Canaanite population, I know it sounds weird because they see the land of Canaan as separate, but all of the evidence suggests that these Hebrew people were just Canaanites who developed their own identity in that context. But that so much of their Yahweh worship happens at precisely the time where Yahweh becomes a useful figure in the context of an agrarian society. They were once a nomadic people, and then they settle. They settle down, and when they settle down, they start planting. And when they plant, then you need gods to do different things than you would if you're just wandering back and forth, throughout the year with your goats and your, sheep and all that stuff. So yeah, it's a lot of projection. It's a lot of projection. But again, that goes back to my idea of that projection serves a purpose, and that purpose is to give authority to how we operate in the world, and and big shock when you go back to like the Ugaritic texts that these other, Canaanite kings would use. They had gods too that were rewarding them for their worship and punishing their enemies, and it sounded a lot like Yahweh. It's he's not the only one. It's just that those texts didn't last in the same way because they didn't have the history worked out differently. So.
All right, next up is J.H. McKenna, Senior Lecturer, Department of Religious Studies at the University of California, Irvine.
The idea of Jesus that people get also comes from their own interiority in them. And so you have a real case of the tail wagging the dog, right? So it's not that people are going to Jesus and trying to seek their politics from Jesus or from the scriptures. They have their politics, and they're going to the scripture to cull the passages they think affirm their politics. Or maybe even worse, they're molding their notion of Jesus into their particular political Jesus, right? So the American Jesus, it's an apt phrase in a way to say the American Jesus, right? The kind of Jesus that a certain type of American envisions. But the thing is I think that there's a moment of caution here that we have to realize too. There are the more moderate Christians and the liberal Christians who have kind of a softer image of Jesus. It too is a projection, probably, right? From their own particular interiority, right? You know, religion burnishes what is already there in a person, right? So a kind person can become kinder, a mean person can become meaner with religion. And political people can become more political, more politicized in this way. But people, I think, project onto Jesus what they want him to be. And so it's another way of having an insight into the person you're speaking with. Tell me about Jesus. And then they talk, and then you're thinking, I'm learning a lot about this person and maybe very little about Jesus, this sort of thing. It might be a bit of a stretch for a far right-wing Republican to cast Jesus as a far right-wing Republican. He seems to have, in terms of the statements that were put into his mouth, what he actually said. I mean, he wrote nothing down. Let's keep that in mind. Others wrote for him. But the words that were put into his mouth seem to be in continuity with the Jewish prophets, who had a lot of warnings for the wealthy and a lot of sympathy for the poor. And those kind of statements are put into the mouth of Jesus too in the Gospels. Right? So it would be very difficult to turn Jesus into a Wall Street CEO type character just from his statements. You know, but I think that people do that.
Well, I think he would agree with everything you just said for the last 20 minutes.
He just said it in a much more articulate way. But exactly, you know, he didn't use the word Rorschach test, and he didn't use the word "it works like alcohol." But that's exactly the point I'm trying to make. The only slight pushback I would make is, yes, though it would be difficult to make Jesus sound like a Wall Street person, it happens all the time, and apparently it hasn't stopped people from making that argument. So it just means that there's a lot more cognitive dissonance there, but we live with cognitive dissonance all the time. So it hasn't actually stopped anyone.
All right, up next is history professor Edward J. Bloom. He teaches at the University of San Diego. He's the author of The Color of Christ. Are you familiar with that book?
I am. I reviewed it for a journal.
The Son of God and the Saga of Race in America.
There are some connections to liberal Christianity today, conservative Christianity today, and the pro-slavery, anti-slavery war. And most of that is how they approach the Bible and how they approach Jesus. Are they word for word literalists, where, okay, if Jesus didn't say anything about slavery, therefore it's not bad, it's okay, you're a literal reading of the Bible. Those people were for slavery, they were okay with it. Conservative Christians today tend to want to read the Bible as literally as possible, word for word. Now, liberal Christians look for the ethics and the values and the morals in the stories of Christianity, in what Jesus had to say. So during the slavery debates, they looked for what are the ideas and the concepts here that Jesus trotted out? What are the narratives? And then how could we apply them to our very different circumstance? It's a recognition of our world is different than theirs. How do we map on his morals and ethics? So now fast forward to our time period, when something like abortion would come up, liberal Christians wouldn't look at the Bible and say, oh, thou shalt not kill, that's killing a baby, therefore it's wrong. Say, well, okay, abortion doesn't come up in the Bible. What are the ethics here? What are the values? How did Jesus deal with, these women who were in pain and suffered who came to him? Did he, condemn them? No, he didn't. And so they look more to that kind of fluidity and openness of how they read. And so I think there are some clear lines from the pro-slavery agenda to conservative Christianity today, and the anti-slavery agenda and how they approach Christianity to liberal Christianity today.
So is that just projection on his part as well?
He's a very good historian. He is a very good historian. And I see what he's trying to say there. I guess the only place I feel a little uncomfortable is this idea that, yes, liberal Christians tend to search for these morals and these values and try and find these connections. But I think the same thing's happening with conservative Christians. They're also looking for particular morals, particular values, and they're also doing their own hermeneutic of the text, trying to make sense of it in a way that fits their vision. I was, the only thing I was a little uncomfortable with is just some of the language that maybe it's just me projecting my own idea of what I think sounds nicer than not. I just felt like it made the liberal Christians sound a lot nicer, a lot more thoughtful, a lot more engaging. And look, one thing is clear, is that conservative Christians take this Bible super seriously, and it's not like they just come off the cuff with stuff. They spend a lot of time interrogating the text in different ways, but they do it so that it will end up, just the same way liberals do, so that it will end up looking like the values that they're bringing to it. So he's right that is how liberal Christians do it. The only thing I think is, I don't think it's not how conservative Christians, I think conservative Christians do a similar thing. He's also 100% right that yes, there are parallels between the question of not just slavery, but the question of racial segregation in the post-slavery era. The arguments that were made to preserve that social hierarchy, that racial hierarchy, did carry over to preserve certain other kinds of hierarchy. I mean, look, there's no question for the record that evolution posed the biggest threat to Christians in the South, precisely because it posited what we now know to be true, which is we all come from the same ancestors. It's somewhere in, East Central Africa, and we're all related. And
yeah, there's no subspecies.
Yeah, and that's a terrifying thing for slaveholders and for segregationists. And so it's not a coincidence that they're also fixated on, you have, in many ways, it forced the hand of these folks to become literalists, because they had to assert, no, this has to be the way it happened. So yeah, I mean,
that's a good point, by the way.
I mean, yeah, it's only just the language that he's using just leaves me a little uncomfortable. But there's nothing he's saying that's wrong. It's just I would maybe use a different language to describe that only because I'm not comfortable. I don't want to fight the wars. I want to observe the wars.
Yeah.
Look, I'll fight the wars on my own private time, but when I put on my academic hat, I don't do that. So
totally understandable.
I want to observe the wars and explain what's happening discursively. So I just don't use certain language to describe it. But I
totally get that.
He's a hell of a scholar, and and there's definitely insight there, and I like that insight.
Next up is Professor Andrew Hartman. He's a professor of history at Illinois State University and the author of the book, A War for the Soul of America, A History of the Culture Wars.
Since the 60s, like how people interpret the 60s will tell you what their politics are. It's a sort of surefire barometer. If the 60s was a great time, a time of change, necessary change, a time of progress, then you're going to be a liberal, you're going to be on the left, you're going to vote Democratic. If the 60s, in your view, were a time when there was a moral decline in the country, which is how many people interpret it, when standards were raised, well, then you are going to be conservative, you're going to vote Republican. And certainly this is the appeal of Donald Trump's campaign slogan, Make America Great Again. When he first rolled that slogan out, I immediately thought about the 1960s, because immediately after the 1960s, many people were nostalgic for the 1950s, or sort of a idealized version of the 1950s. That's been a deep current in our culture ever since. And so the 60s, I think, did produce revolutionary changes at the cultural level, but then also become a myth in our culture that everyone has to position themselves for or against. If if you think about the 1950s, if you're white and you're middle class, it's a pretty good time, especially if you fit in well in a traditional sort of lifestyle. Nuclear family was stronger in the 1950s than before and after. Church-going rates were incredibly high. But, you know, if you're black, if you're gay, if you're a woman who doesn't want that traditional lifestyle, the 50s are not a good time.
His comments about, make America great again always makes me think of great for who?
But the beauty of it is it's so ambiguous that look, liberals have their own nostalgia about the past too, even though there's like a horror of white supremacy and a horror of patriarchy and all these things. There's also looking back about, we'll still point to the framers of the Constitution as like, oh, they understood, about this thing, and then we'll ignore the fact that, we still make those arguments using the same sources of authority. My way of going back now is when I talk, my personal framing of this story, I go back to the Civil War, and I feel a sense of frustration, like, why don't we call, Thaddeus Stevens and Edwin Stanton and Ulysses S. Grant, why are they not the founders? Why are they not the founders? Because America was refounded during that Civil War period. So that's me doing a nostalgia bit on a group of people who, frankly, if you start dissecting their worldviews, they're hardly progressive, but hey, at least they, wanted an end to slavery, and most of them, as the radical Republican group at the time, wanted a much harsher treatment of the aristocratic South that had seemed to have managed to get through that war scot-free without the punishment. My personal view is we wouldn't have had many of the problems we have today. But what's going on when I tell you my personal view? What's going on is I'm manufacturing a nostalgic vision of a past that I want to point to say, oh, those people got it. But they don't got it. I mean, they don't. It's funny, I was just listening to, I have this great-great-grandfather who fought in the Civil War with the Ohio Voluntary Infantry, the 42nd Regiment of the Ohio Voluntary. About a decade ago, I had this idea, which I finally carried out this summer, where I wanted to trace back the path of his regiment. So I started with his grave in Cleveland, Ohio, and I went down to Columbus, where they did basic training, down to Cincinnati, down to Kentucky, and they fought, this was the regiment that was organized by James Garfield, who went on to become the 20th President of the United States. And it was his success with this regiment early on that kind of propelled him into national prominence. So I followed these paths and the circuitous route, and it was all very interesting. But as I was doing this, I was listening to, a few books, but one of the books was General Sherman. William Tecumseh Sherman. And I had always, I associated William Tecumseh Sherman with, like, this is a guy who kicked some Confederate ass, like, yeah, this is what I like to see. This is an evil, horrible movement, and he's the one who crushes it. And as I read this, or as I listen to this biography, I'm just struck with there was almost nothing about the man that I liked. He was not only an unrepentant racist. His problem with the South seemed to be that it violated some sort of order. That it wasn't that slavery was immoral. In fact, he didn't think it was, and he maintained this really gross retrograde vision of race in his life. And from my perspective, listening to this is a guy who never really changed anything that he thought in an entire 70 roughly years of life. Like, his basic worldview never changed, and in my perspective, that's sort of a sad thing. Like, your worldview should be adapting.
Developing, yes.
But anyway, the point was, here you have this idea of what the past is, and then you're confronted with a much messier reality of, the evidence shows this guy's no hero. I'm glad he did what he did, I'm glad he burned it all down. And in fact, it's a problematic narrative. He didn't for instance, they weren't even the ones who burned Atlanta. That was mostly on the retreating forces on the way out, trying to leave nothing for the Union. But that's another story.
Political science at the University of Nebraska.
60 years ago, a big issue was interracial marriage. You know, a lot of states banned interracial marriage. A black person could not marry a white person. Now, you know, it's not really an issue. But gay marriage was for a while. Even that's diminishing now. So I think the particular issue might change from decade to decade. But what doesn't change is that there are certain kinds of individuals that are reacting negatively to whatever the new issue is, or the new lifestyle, the new approach that is bothersome to them. So the same kind of person who was bothered by interracial marriage 60 years ago was bothered by gay marriage and maybe transgender bathrooms today. So in that sense, I think you do see some commonality. It gets a little tricky because sometimes conservatives do want change. But if you think about it, they usually want change of a nature that they believe will bring us back to kind of the legitimate role of things in society. So maybe conservatives are the one who are advocating for new federalism, take Ronald Reagan's phrase, where we're going to shift all the authority to state governments and away from Washington. Or we're going to change the tax code. So it's not that conservatives don't want change, but they usually want change to bring it back to the way they thought it was long ago. I mean, before 1916, we didn't have an income tax in the United States. So there's some things that they would say, we need change to go back to the traditional way of doing things. And so I think you have to, again, maybe step back from those issues of the day, which confuse people, and try to understand what's kind of the bedrock dilemma that's at play here. And it's usually whether you want security and tradition or not. Because a lot of liberals, that's not a big issue to them. They don't know why conservatives are so threatened all the time. They don't see why they have concerns. And conservatives can manifest those things in very different ways. Some of them are isolationist, and some of them are interventionists. And you say, well, so how can these deeper kinds of concepts that we're talking about be relevant when they have different manifestations? But I think in both of those cases, whether you want to build Fortress America and become secure that way, or whether you want to go get the bad guys before they come get us, you're still reflecting a real concern with security. And liberals, on the other hand, say, we don't really like either of those options because, look, those people in outgroups are just not as dangerous as you think they are. A lot of it comes back to security again, not to sound like a broken record here, but having guns is a way that we can be secure. We're going to stop that bad guy from doing something to us. And so liberals come back and say, look, there are a lot more gun deaths that occur because of accidents, people having guns around their house. And they need to realize that doesn't mean anything to conservatives. That's not what they're concerned with. The statistics are not the key thing there so much as this vision that they have of I'm not going to be able to protect me and my family because that person has a bigger weapon than I do. And that to them is a deal breaker. And so I think, a lot of liberals don't understand that, but they just have to recognize that this desire for security and to be able to protect you and your loved ones is something that resonates with them in a way that most liberals simply can't understand.
So interesting, the work that John is doing at the University of Nebraska is looking at the biological factors that make us conservative and liberal.
Yeah,
because there are
some of that
there are certain divides, and listening to his comments there makes me think there's no really religious component to this except that I would say, and see if you agree with this, I would say that people are neutral, conservative, liberal, and then possibly they find the religion that matches their nature, basically.
Well, I mean, most people don't find they're raised in them.
That's true.
So on one sense, it's most people don't deviate far from what they were raised in. They may make sense of what they were raised in differently, but they're but everything that guy said I thought was pretty spot on. In fact, I kept thinking when he gave the analogy of when he talked about gun violence, for instance, I thought, oh, this comes back to Schleiermacher. This is about what matters is how I feel, and it is. It's like people feel secure, more secure, when they have the gun in their house. The fact that gun is statistically more likely to be used on a very bad day, putting a bullet in their own head, or one of their children on some horrible thing, whether it's accident, whether it's intentional, or in a moment of passion. The fact that gun's more likely to be used against someone they know and love, as opposed to somebody who's literally threatening their family and their lives, that fact doesn't matter, because they feel a certain way about it, and you're not going to really persuade somebody otherwise if their feelings move, which ironically puts the liberal on the side of the biblical, the biblical supremacist, the one who says Scripture says this, i.e., the stats say this, and all of a sudden here, it flips the other way, where the conservatives like, yeah, but I feel like that gun's gonna keep me safe someday, and I feel like there's still, I don't know.
We are back with political organizer Rob Briersey.
Objectivity is something that doesn't exist. Everybody has biases. Everybody has a perspective and a background, and we can't escape it. And so we find what we're looking for in the stories we read. And so I think Christians interpret the Bible differently because we're all subjective. We all have biases. We all have perspectives. And I think this idea that, well, I'm going to find like the one absolute truth, I'm going to do this in an objective way. The people who think that actually are the most blinded. The way to overcome your bias is to admit that you have it. The way to recognize, oh, I might be shading this and reading this through rose-colored glasses that I want to read it through, is to recognize that you're wearing them. The person who's oblivious to them is never going to recognize that, like, there are other perspectives. So I actually don't see it as a problem that people interpret the Bible differently. I actually think that helps us, that tension gives us a fuller understanding of things, and that we can actually find the truth in the tension of how we wrestle with the text. But when our approach is, here's the correct interpretation of the Bible, fill in the notes in your notebook, the blanks in your notebook, and just memorize it and you'll be good, that's not an approach that I think is helpful. I mean, I have been on both sides of this divide. I have been the conservative, white, Republican voting, Rush Limbaugh listening to, traditional conservative. For me, that journey from one side to the other came about as I had a total transformation of my faith. That deconstruction that I went through radically altered not just how I read the Bible, but how I interact with people, how I exist in the world, how I vote, all of those things. It all was interconnected. And like a web, you start pulling at one thread, and all of these other threads are connected and coming too. And so as I began to read the Bible in a much more broad and generous way, I think I became much more open and generous in how I deal with people as well.
What do you think about his concept of, the tension between the liberal, conservative view of the Bible, reading it is a good thing?
It's neither good nor bad. It's inevitable. It's, it's a good thing the sun rises or sets. It's a good thing we revolve around the sun and we spin. It's a good thing these happen. But I mean, yeah, but it's also, it's inevitable until it's not in billions of years down the road. So, yeah, I do think that there's value, since we know that we're wrong. I mean, if we're honest with ourselves, we're wrong about a lot of things. Our hunches are incorrect. We're also all, we have feelings about people that we know to be not good feelings. We have biases that are, problematic biases when we encounter certain people. We've got all sorts of messiness in our world. So if we were the barometer of all things, it'd be an awful world, I mean, yeah, it'd be an awful world.
Well, I mean, and also that if you take a dive into evolutionary psychology, you get to understand why it's so messy. Because there's systems that we still carry with us that don't really have any value today. That's still in us. But that's another documentary.
No, that is another documentary. But it's very true, and so much of our emotional lives are dictated by those
holdovers from a much earlier period of our development.
All right, one last comment from history professor Andrew Hartman.
The purpose of the culture wars, or the reason for them, is that we in the United States have always had this debate about what it means to be an American. I think this is the only thing that really ties us together, is that we're all willing to have that debate. And after the 1960s, that debate got incredibly heated because our answers to it were so different. And the people who voted for Donald Trump and the people who continue to support him, they have a very particular answer that many other Americans don't recognize as their country. Some of us recognize the country as being multicultural, as being moving towards having more feminist values, as being much more aligned with a sort of global community that wants to cooperate on issues of major importance like climate change. But there's many, many Americans who don't see that as being the definitive way to think about our country.
What do you think about that idea of the debate of what it means to be an American, especially through the lens of Christianity?
His point about one of the things that defines an American is somebody who argues about what an American is, right?
Right.
So I often will say in class that the defining feature of what we're going to call someone a Christian is somebody who's invested in the idea of what a Christian is. And I like to, in my intro religion classes, I like to do these, use the image of a network, like a social network with all the little dots and the lines connecting. And I think of these religious traditions, whether it's Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, these kinds of isms, I think of them as basically these discursive networks of people who, what they have in common is that they share certain stories. They share certain stories that they use authoritatively in their worlds. In other words, they use them mythically. They use them as myth to give authority to how to be in the world. They have texts. They have individuals and institutions that they point to that they use as authorities, and that's what defines their connection. Is that, oh yeah, we all agree that this is an authority for. So if I'm a Southern Baptist from Oklahoma and I'm having a conversation with a Advaita Vedanta practitioner or philosopher from India, and one person's talking about the Vedas and then the other's talking about Scripture, you're going to talk past each other. You might have things in common if you really spend a lot of time talking, although probably not those two groups so much. But you might have some things. But what defines them as communities is that they are engaged in these debates, these discussions, this give and take about what constitutes authenticity, an authentic Christian version, authentic Hindu version, real Christianity. And we use this word, and when I'm saying authenticity, I'm putting quotes around it because the word authenticity, it's, in my academic view, it's like a cudgel to just beat people.
Right.
Because, we define one thing as authentic. It always looks like the stuff we like, and the other stuff is not the authentic. But he's right about this vision of America as this, and of course, it overlaps with what people say about Christianity. And basic in-group out-group dynamics sort of dictate that we're going to define ourselves in ways that differentiate ourselves from other people, and we want those definitions to align in some sort of way. And if I identify myself as a Christian, and I identify myself as an American, and I like those identities, and I've imagined those identities in ways that align with other aspects of my overall personal identity, then it's not surprising that people want to blend them, want to say, oh, but these have a lot to do with each other. We can't separate these two, because you can't separate those two in those two people, or in that one person.
Right.
In that one person who identifies themselves in that way. So, and the pushback is, hey, that's not my identity. That's not what I want, and we go back and forth, So this very same person who goes on about the glories of America one minute
is also the same person who goes on about the horrors of America in the next minute, because what they're really saying is the horror is the stuff that they consider to be inauthentic Americanness, you know, and the stuff that they think is authentic is the good stuff. And then find somebody else who hates that stuff that they think is the good stuff, and you know, it's just language. It's language, and it's what we do to create our order, is to make sense of the world through that language.
And that's a never-ending process.
It's a never-ending process. There's no victor here. There's not going to be a point at which real Christianity shines through. There are consequences to every. I don't want to. When I say this is like a language thing, I don't want that to make it sound as though I'm saying there aren't real, tangible consequences to every single one of these visions. There are tangible consequences to every social construct that of any value or meaning in our world. So the fact that we're imagining it, the fact that we're using words and just words and sounds and text to make it up, doesn't mean that it doesn't have something to do with whether or not, you know, people are marginalized, whether or not they have voting rights, whether or not they, you know, get to buy a house, whether or not they get to send their kids to this, that, or the other school, whether or not all of those things are directly impacted by these constructs that we form. So when I talk about this as language, kind of almost a language game thing, those games have consequences, real consequences, measurable consequences. Football is a construct, but there are measurable consequences to football. I'm sorry to hit the thing. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. There are people who become wealthy. There are gamblers who become poor, all as a result of this ridiculous construct that has no actual. It was invented by our remarkably creative and strange minds. That, you know, well, that's true of all of these other things too. I don't ever want to dismiss this as just, oh, these people say this and those people say that, and nobody's really objective, and everybody's got a bias. And it all matters. It matters because how we actually live in the world. This is the distinction between the privileged and those who aren't. You know, I mean, I'm a white upper middle class cisgendered male who just. It sounds like you won the lottery. Yeah, I did, right? And there are certain things that probably won't happen to me as a result of my social position, no matter how bad things get. But there are plenty of others who that's not how they're going to be. That their lives aren't going to be affected in that way.
Our last comment is from Samuel Abrams, who is a professor at Sarah Lawrence College and the author of the book Disconnect, the breakdown of representation in American politics.
So much of human history, not to mention American history, can be shaped around the question of what tribe are you part of? What group do you deeply, deeply identify with? And how do you react accordingly? And the weird thing about tribalism is that it often supersedes other concerns, other issues. Tribalism and the dominant narrative of, well, it's us, this is important to us, can often trump, no pun intended, issues of economics, issues of family, issues of morality, because it becomes something that's just core, guttural within you. And it's just a very powerful organizing and mobilizing force. We certainly see it today in America and American politics, and we've seen it throughout human history.
What comes to mind hearing for you when you're listening to what Sam had to say?
Well, I think he's spot on with this sense of tribalism. I made this reference to kind of identity theory, and we develop identities and we identify ourselves with other people. That appears to be, I'm going to use the word nature here, but it appears to be kind of a natural process. People tend to do that. Even people who identify themselves as not having an identity with another group tend to align themselves with other people who make that claim.
Well, evolutionary, this is a very important thing.
It is. And I do think to some degree, and of course, it's important to remember that those identities shift, that they're not intrinsic identities, that identities are circumstantial. and certain contexts bring out, they're mobilized in this context, they're not mobilized in another. And that's an important thing, because we have a tendency in our society to talk about identity as though they're always, that they're fixed, they're dominant, and that they're, they're the central thing. But context brings out different ones, right? So the example I always give is living in Kansas City, Missouri. If you're familiar with Kansas City, it's a town where you have these there are 3 major universities within 2 hours of Kansas City, with sports teams that tend to hate each other historically. The Missouri Tigers, the Kansas Jayhawks, the K-State Wildcats. And so those 3 groups on a Saturday hate each other's guts and want to see the other team lose all the time. And then on Sunday, those same people who hated each other's guts the day before, it's sports hate, it's not real hate, but it's sports hate. They hate each other's guts, and then all of a sudden they're all sitting in the same stadium giving high fives as the Chiefs are doing whatever, or, So it's circumstantial. Certain things mobilize those feelings in us, where all of a sudden, because any of our identities, we're not constantly aware of it. Most of what we're aware of is, I'm not thinking about my identity as a white cisgendered man when I'm beeping at somebody who's just cut me off on the road, or I'm not, nobody is. I'm, what's for breakfast? What am I doing for, those things don't, but they're mobilized at different points. And I do think there are maybe one of the more distinguishing features of left and right, conservative and liberal in our society today, as we're defining those terms, does have to do with how people think of their team. And liberals have a tendency to think more species-wide, global-wide. They see themselves as citizens of the world, right? More, not always, again, only at certain contexts, right? When the Olympics start in a couple of days for us, the Olympics are just being done like that, then my team is Team USA. My mother's Brazilian, so I'll root for the Brazilians sometimes too. But those, all of a sudden, it's not the world. I'm aligned with this group. But then in other contexts, when I think climate change, I think the world. When I think all of these various things. And maybe it's possible that the divides tend to be the divide tend to be there's some people who don't break out so much from the local, from the familial, from the church community, from the small town, from the state, from the region. It takes longer for that to happen. But again, I'm also of the opinion that there are moments where people are mobilized, that the context can shift all of that, and all those generalizations that I've just made are really contingent upon certain circumstances, and those circumstances can change. But we'd be naive to think that somehow that the contexts that lead to one or lead to the other aren't real contexts, that there really are struggles about resources in our world, and there are competing interests, and there are limited resources, and there are all of these things that lead to to this.
And you talking about being activated, like if Russia attacked the U.S. tomorrow, we'd all be on the same
liberal
page.
And conservative would all be on the same page. We would.
100%.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. We wouldn't have much time probably to be on the same page. We'd all be
but if it was
dead after a while.
If it was a conventional
war, absolutely,
we'd all be on the same page.
One would hope. I mean, there's got to be somebody who wouldn't, but that's 99% of us.
That's
would,
Noam Chomsky, isn't it? It's
yes.
the only person who's not going to be on the page.
He'd be on that page too. He's not a fan of that. So.
Well, any last thoughts before we wrap it up?
It's been an interesting exercise. I'm sorry if I kept coming back to the same themes over and over again.
No, you just made me realize that's, I mean, when you break it down, which is what we're doing to this episode, is like, it's just folks are, using their form of religion, their interpretation of it for their needs, their desires, and their efforts, what they're trying to get accomplished, and it helps to have God on your side. I don't know if that's an oversimplification of what you're saying, but I mean,
I wouldn't say that they just use the religion. I would say that Well, they use a discourse. Yeah, I guess
Right.
they do.
I mean,
they use a discourse.
I'm not saying they don't believe it. It's
Yeah.
just
Yeah, they believe it. People believe these things. I mean, obviously there's cynical players in every context
Sure.
somewhere, but people really believe what they believe, and how could they not? I mean, you know.
Well, thank you for your time on the
Thank you.
on the documentary, and thank you for sitting down today and breaking this segment down, and your thoughts and opinions and all your expertise is greatly appreciated.
Well, sure. Thank you very much. I
You
appreciate
betcha.
it. It was a fun conversation.
Thanks for listening to the Director's Cut of episode number 3. There is a lot to digest for sure. I want to thank Professor Craig Prentiss for his expertise and knowledge. He's been extremely helpful in understanding some of the history of religion and theology. I hope you'll join us for the Director's Cut of episode 4, where we break down the issues that separate liberal and conservative Christians. Thank you and take care.